Well, hello, beautiful people. You know who you are. It's good to see each one of you. If you have your Bibles with you today, as we step into our teaching time, we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we're going to look at the first 13 verses of this chapter. In 2 weeks, Easter. You're all planning to be here, yes? Yes. We're going to be jumping ahead in our Corinthians series to chapter 15. Paul has some really important and fun things to say about resurrection and what that means for us, and so we're going to jump to that in 2 weeks. But today we're here in chapter 10. When I was in driver's ed years ago, my driving instructor would pick on me with one bad habit that I had. I never checked my rearview mirror. You know, that's a thing. Checking your rearview mirror. He told me he would be driving along, we'd be going along, and all of a sudden he had a notebook and he would just put it up and cover my rearview mirror and say, "What color is the car behind you?" And I'd be like, "I don't know. I'm not looking behind me. I'm looking in front of me. I'm paying attention to the road ahead of me." And he's like, "Nope. It's as important to pay attention to your rearview mirror as it is to pay attention to what's in front of you." And in our text this morning, Paul says the same thing to us. He kind of waves his hand at our rearview mirror of our lives, and he says, you've got to make sure that you pay attention to what has happened in the past so that it impacts your future. Right? You with me? So chapter 10, look at verse 1 to 4. "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and that they passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food. They drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ." So right out of the gate, Paul is pointing out in our rearview mirror that our God is faithful. Our God is faithful. When it comes to God's faithfulness, things never change. So in those early days of the nation of Israel, to us in these last days, God is faithfully providing, faithfully watching over our lives, faithfully blessing our lives. And Paul recounts some of the classic examples of God's provision back in the day in our rearview mirror. He calls out guidance, that God guided them. Many of you know these stories. God pulled his people out of Egypt, out of bondage in Egypt, and he led them through the desert with what? A pillar of fire by night, remember? And a pillar of cloud by day. Who would like to have that kind of clear direction from God right now? Maybe something you're facing in your life. Boy, I would like to know step by step, right? But that's what God does, that kind of clear guidance. Then he talks about the protection he gave them. That pillar of cloud and pillar of fire led the nation of Israel step by step right up to the shores of the Red Sea with the Egyptian army right on their tails. Now what? God parted the waters, led them safely through the waters of the sea on dry ground. They weren't slogging through the mud. They were on dry ground. A miracle of protection. And there's countless stories of God's protection of his people in the Old Testament. He identified his people as his own. As followers of Moses, God's deliverer, they were all baptized, the text says. That means they were marked out as God's dearly loved people, branded as his possession. God took them all through quite an adventure. Liberation from Egypt, through the desert, through the sea, leading them to the promised land. Then he talks about the provision of food. Along the way, God even provided food. Miraculous manna that fell from heaven. Each day, just enough for the day. It's crazy. And then on the night before the Sabbath, he gave enough for 2 days, so they didn't have to gather on the Sabbath. I mean, he thinks of everything. Then the provision of water. Out in the desert, you know, water's the key. And he provided all the water this million-plus group of people needed, and all their herds and livestock. That's amazing. He teaches us that it was miraculous water because God brought it out of a rock, and Paul identifies that rock as a symbol of supernatural sustenance to us and through Jesus. Here's what all this teaches us right out of the gate in these first 4 verses. While God's methods may change in your life, his faithfulness will not. While his methods may change, his faithfulness will not. That's a fact we can always count on. We may not understand God's methods at given time in our lives, but we can always trust his faithfulness. Maybe you've heard the saying, if you can't trace his hand, trust his heart, because it's faithful. Now, here's the risk this presents for us. Consistency can bring on complacency. Consistency can bring on complacency. Affluence can produce apathy. Here's what I mean. For the people of God in the past and for us today, consistent care can subtly contribute to our complacency. In short, God's faithfulness to us, if we're not careful, can actually produce flakiness in us. God's faithfulness to us can produce flakiness in it. And that always leads to trouble. It's human nature. Look how Paul describes it, verse 5. Nevertheless, hold on a second. So all of this goodness that he cites in these first 4 verses, then he starts verse 5 with nevertheless. So it's like, man, all of that goodness that God showed to them, nevertheless. Well, what happened? Nevertheless, what happened? God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the desert. Now, these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. It always brings on trouble. We should not test Christ as some of them did and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel. See, in the wake of God's faithful provision, many became complacent, bringing on trouble in their lives. Paul said, look in your rearview mirror. Remember these stories. Instead of God's faithful care for these people, producing gratitude, what you might think would be, heightened devotion, obedience, it led to complacency. Instead of honoring him, this is our human nature. Instead of honoring him with their lives in greater and greater ways, they set their hearts on evil things. Wait, what? Paul says, guys, you got to check your rearview mirror. You got to check your rearview mirror. You have to see this. You have to avoid this foolish mistake. You see in your Bibles there that phrase in verse 6, setting our hearts on evil things. That means instead of honoring God's faithfulness, they lusted after, longed for, craved, desired, were eager to participate in the very things that dishonored God. Are you getting this? Though they were full recipients of God's gracious and faithful care, they grew complacent in their obedience to him. They subtly became lured away from God by the people and practices and cultures around them. Have you noticed how easy that is to happen in your life? Right? Our culture has a lot of glitz and glamour and flash and brilliance, right? Bright, shiny light. Take our focus off God easy. Paul lists 4 specific examples of their disobedience. Let's look at them. They began to pollute their worship. He cites the tragedy of Exodus 32. Fresh off the miracles of deliverance from Egypt, fresh off the miracles of direction from the cloud and the fire by night, provision through the Red Sea. What did the people do? Worship God with all of their hearts? No. They created a golden calf and worshiped its leader instead. Why? Because Moses happened to be gone too long. Now, before you point a judgmental finger at them, realize you got 3 pointing back at yourself, right? The pagan revelry he refers to from that scene is at the base of Mount Sinai is basically a nice way of referring to a sexual orgy, which was part of the pagan religious worship practices. It's hard to imagine this happening after all of the faithfulness from God that they had seen. The word Paul uses here for idolaters is a word that refers to, and we need to pay attention to this, it refers to someone who worships a false god or participates in any way with exalting anyone or anything above the one true and living God. Valuing anyone and anything above the one true God. That's the definition of idolatry. Here's what's important for you to know. The sin of idolatry occurs when your devotion to anyone or anything is more pronounced than your devotion to God. That's worthy of some reflection because our culture is bright and shiny and it's very distracting. We can make just about anything an idol in our lives. We can make just about anything an idol in our lives. Money, sex, power, career, alcohol, girlfriend, boyfriend, spouse, recreation, sports, leisure, control, fitness, fishing. No, not fishing. It got a little crazy. Your own intelligence, education can be a god. It can be a god. It can be an idol. The Israelites had grown complacent in their relationships with God, and subtly at first, they allowed their devotion to other gods water down their devotion to God. This means they began to rest their dependency for life and well-being on someone or something other than the true and living God. This happens to us very, very subtly in our lives, friends. It's easy to be the recipient of God's faithful care, but over time, almost become kind of comfortable in it. And then we forget the blessing that it is. We forget where it came from. And then subtly, other things lure us away, our focus, and we start to dilute our devotion to God. It can happen. We have to really be watching this, friends. Now, not only did they dilute their worship with idols, notice in verse 8, he specifically calls out that they destroyed themselves with sexual immorality. In other words, the sexual immorality they participated in, it was literally destructive for them. Here, he references a situation in Numbers 25 where the people of Israel, again, after seeing all of these amazing things and experiencing all this amazing provision from God, these folks were lured away from devotion to God by the culture around them, and it polluted their pure devotion of God through the worship of pagan gods. It all started because some of the Israelites began sleeping with Moabite women. First they went to bed with them, then they went to church with them. And the text says, before long, Israel was joining in on the worship of the pagan gods. Joining in that. In fact, the bigger context of Corinthians, that's what Paul is arguing, because the people were not just eating meat offered to idols, as Dylan was talking about last week. They were going to their worship services and eating it in the flow and in participation of their worship. Paul says, You see, in this text in Numbers, after that, God was so serious about this, it was so destructive that 24,000 were put to death. Here's one of the lessons Paul's very anxious for his readers to walk away with. Though God is faithful to provide and love and guide and grace and protect us, he remains a holy God. He remains a holy God. He hates sin for two primary reasons. You need to be aware of this. He hates sin for two primary reasons. One, because it offends his holiness. Makes sense. Two, he hates sin because it destroys the lives of the people he loves so deeply. His anger and judgment of sin, if you have some issues with that, is actually evidence of his holiness and his love for you. Because he hates what sin does to you, to your heart, to your soul, to your spirit, to your body. We cannot allow the grace he has lavished on us to seduce us into thinking that sin isn't that big of a deal. Oh, he'll forgive me. God's loving. He'll forgive me. It's not that big of a deal. I mean, he understands. We can't allow ourselves to become complacent in our obedience to God because we know that Jesus has already paid the price for our sin. Well, Jesus already died on the cross for me. He's already qualified me for heaven. It's okay. As recipients of God's goodness and blessing and provision, we cannot grow complacent and push the limits of God's patience or test the limits of his goodness. This is why Paul says in verse 9 there, we should not test the Lord as some of them did. We should not test the Lord as some of them did. The idea here is that some of the people of God, because they knew they were God's chosen people, they became overly confident and complacent in their relationships with God. In other words, they tested God to see how he would behave himself. They tested him to see how much he would let them get away with since they were his chosen people. You see how that could happen? Well, he made a covenant with us. We're his chosen people. I mean, he's never going to turn his back on us, so it's okay. Many of them acted as if they had God kind of like backed in a corner. Like, well, you said, you love me with an everlasting love. You said, covenant, you said. Just like every child who tests the limits of how far his or her parent will allow them to go, the children of God tested the Father. How gracious is he? How long-suffering is he? How loving is he? Folks, testing God is a really, 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 really bad idea. We must never live our lives in such a way that it presumes on God's goodness or cheapens his mercy and grace. Paul asks it this way, since grace abounds where sin abounds, should we keep on sinning so that God can show us more and more of his wonderful grace? Do you see the twisted reasoning? Well, if grace abounds where sin abounds, why don't we sin all the more? So grace abounds all the more. We'll do God a favor. We'll let him lavish his grace. You know how Paul ends that? He says, with the most firm negative in the Greek language, may it never be. Think it through with me. I mean, a genuine relationship with God is based on love, yes? Okay? Then, when you genuinely love someone, how do you treat them? Do you see how much you can ignore them before they say something? Like the guy said, honey, I told you I loved you on our wedding day. If anything changes, I'll let you know. Is that how you treat the person you love? Or do you see how rude you can be to them to test how much they really love you? Saying, I'm going to see if my spouse really loves me. I'm going to be a jerk. And then we'll test her love. No. Do you allow yourself to do things or say things that you know will offend them? Is that how you, no. A healthy, genuine love for another is demonstrated with actions and behaviors that please the other person, actions that respect and honor the other, actions that communicate gratitude and appreciation for being loved by them. If that type of desire is not there, you have to wonder if there's any love at all for the other. Pointing to their rearview mirror once again in a kind of final evil that they had set their hearts on. One final specific example that we can learn from. Look at verse 10. I think it's interesting that introduces this one in what you might say is an otherwise list of biggies. Verse 10, and do not grumble as some of them did. After they had been through all they've been through with God, after all his miraculous provision, faithful protection, it seems as though the moment the journey started feeling a little too long, people grew impatient. And again, before you judge, be honest with yourself. They started to complain against God. Why'd you bring us out here? There's nothing to eat. There's nothing to drink. I'm sick of this manna. I mean, the list goes on. It's like teenagers on a long road trip. Dad, are we there yet? This is dumb. Tell her to stop touching me. I'm hungry. Right? Paul makes reference to a situation in Numbers 16, but there are countless references to people of God murmuring and grumbling among themselves about how things were going for them or about the particular methods that God was using to care for them at the time. It's so easy to fall into this trap. I have done this so many times. When my life starts to go a direction or things start happening that I just think are not right. And God should know better. Right? And when are you going to, be God? When are you going to do something? Right? We all know our lives are in God's sovereign care. We know that he loves us and he has our best interests at heart, right? I mean, would you sign off for that? Yeah. But when things don't go our way or in our timing, when things don't work out like we planned or how we envisioned them, it's so easy to just kick at stones with God about it. That word grumble in your text there contains the idea of a judgment and a condemnation of God by man. When you're grumbling, instead of giving God thanks and showing obedience, when you're grumbling, you set yourself up as judge over God. When we grumble, we're subtly saying, we know better how to run our lives. How silly is that? But we do it, don't we? The common denominator in all of these scenarios that Paul's reminding us of was that the people of God were enjoying their watch care and their blessing of God. They were recipients of God's faithful provision, guidance, protection, provision. But as the human heart is prone to do, they got sucked into the degradation. They grew comfortable and they began to presume on God's care. Then they became complacent in their relationship with him. Then their devotion to him began to get diluted. And then their sin resulted in discipline and judgment from God. It was a negative spiral. You see that? Thankfully, if we'll take time to learn, this is Paul's point, if we'll take time to learn from their past, our futures can be very different. Yay? Look at verse 11. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for who? For us, for the reader. Written down as warnings for us on whom the culmination of the ages has come. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. The warning Paul issues here is a warning. We've all heard it before. Pay attention to the past. Don't let history repeat itself. If you ignore history, right, you're doomed to repeat it, right? Learn from their mistakes, Paul says. It's a warning against allowing God's care in your life to seduce you into complacency. So Paul says it. So if you think you're standing firm, be careful you don't fall. This Hibernia oil platform is off the coast of Newfoundland, and it's anchored to the seabed in this section of the ocean which is very often traveled by massive icebergs. And so this oil platform is anchored to the sea bottom, and if you can see around the base of it, right at water level, there's like 18 concrete teeth that are around it that are designed to absorb a collision with an iceberg that weighs up to 1 million pounds. And so this happens, they say, about every 500 years. They built this thing to withstand. And the engineers say that it actually can absorb a 6 million pound iceberg that happens every 10,000 years. So they over-engineered it, so they say. But even though it has all of that kind of protection from iceberg, they also track and monitor every iceberg in the region within 27 miles of this oil platform. And when there's any iceberg of size, they go out to it with those ships and they lasso it and pull it away, or they blast it with water cannons or the jet wash of their engine to steer it away from this platform. These guys took no chance. If you think that you're safe or you think you're staying, but be careful there, you fall. They never gave it a chance to use all of the safety precautions because they were constantly monitoring where the potential crisis was coming from. The Corinthians, as we said, were relatively young in their faith, but they had quickly become somewhat arrogant or overconfident in their security in Jesus. As the saying goes, familiarity breeds contempt. The Corinthians believed that they were so set, they were so secure in their relationships with Jesus that they became audacious and sloppy in their obedience. And Paul wanted to restore their awareness and restore their vigilance. He knew that learning from the past could provide a different future. So how do we avoid repeating mistakes of the past that Paul's referring to here? He urges us to be careful. To be careful. We avoid complacency by paying close attention to how we live our lives. Being alert to how easy it is to shrug sin off, excuse it, rationalize it, or surrender it. Some of you remember the bankruptcy issues with Enron and WorldCom several years ago. Jim Collins, best-selling business author, writes about that experience this way. He says some business executives were part of the malleable masses, he calls them. They were people who, in the presence of an opportunity to behave differently, got drawn into it one step after another. If you told them 10 years ahead of time, hey, let's cook the books and all get rich, they would have said, no way. But that's rarely how most people get drawn into activities that they later regret. Think about this in terms of your temptation and sin. When you're at step A, it feels inconceivable to jump all the way to step Z if step Z involves something that's a total breach of your values. But if you go from step A to step B, step C, to step D, then someday you'll wake up and discover you're at step Y. And the move to step Z comes about much easier. See how that works? You know that to be true. Social psychologists call this process commitment and consistency. In Milton Mayer's essay, They Thought They Were Free, he explains the process this way. A farmer never notices the corn growing minute by minute. But if he stays in the field long enough, he wakes up one day to discover that it has grown over his head. The people who make up the malleable masses weren't bad at the outset, but through a series of gradual steps. This is how it happens, isn't it, friends? A gradual steps, they end up in bad situations, in over their heads. Paul says, this is why Paul says, if you think you're standing firm, be careful. Pay attention. Be alert. Be on watch. Be careful that you do not fall. Pay careful attention so you can realize when you're being tempted, and when you're being tempted, you can be intentional about avoiding it. He said something in verse 13 that's super important. Look at that with me. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And here it is again. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, but when you are tempted, he will provide a way out so that you can endure it. Friends, do you realize that God provides a way out no matter where or when or how you face temptation in your life? He will make a way out. You know what the problem is, though? Most of us are going too fast, or we're too obsessed about our desires to ever see the off-ramp. We don't see the off-ramp. We blow by the off. Think about it for a minute. In every temptation you face, God has promised to provide a way out. Too many times, we blow right past the off-ramp. But this text teaches us, in every temptation, God has promised to provide an off-ramp. So let's be alert to his provision. Let's take advantage of it and not let the tragic history in our rearview mirror recreate itself in our lives. Let me draw four primary takeaways for us as we wrap up. Number one, I've said it before, but I just want to emphasize it again as we wrap up. We got to learn from the past, friends. Make sure you learn from that. Make sure you're spending time in the Old Testament, reading those Old Testament stories. Those are all recorded for your benefit so you can learn from some of the foolishness that happened. So you don't have to go through it and learn the hard way, right? I would rather, in my life, learn from other people's pain and hardship than have to go through it myself. Paul puts his notepad over our rearview mirror today and asks, do you remember what happened? You remember what happened? It'll go better for you if you learn from the past and avoid making similar errors. Number two, key takeaway, guard against complacency. We've got to guard against complacency. In Greek mythology, Icarus was the son of Daedalus, a brilliant inventor. Daedalus created wings for himself and his son Icarus to escape from prison. And as they flew over the sea, as the mythology goes, Icarus became overconfident and complacent, ignoring his father's warning to stay close and avoid flying too high. Icarus soared higher and higher until the heat from the sun melted the wax that held his wings together. He plummeted into the sea, drowning in the waters below. The ancient Greek myth illustrates the dangers of overconfidence and complacency. When we become too confident in our abilities or our circumstances, we can ignore warnings. We can take unnecessary risks. We can ultimately suffer devastating consequences. God is so good to us, and he always has been, friends. Let's not allow his faithful care of our lives to seduce us into complacency in our obedience to him. Let's not get lazy. Let's not become apathetic or indifferent. Let's run the race in such a way as to get the prize. Third key takeaway, recognize the dangers of idolatry. Most time we read these stories about idolatry in the Old Testament, when we go, well, we don't do that anymore. I don't really have idol. I don't have anything carved. I'm not, worshiping carved things in my house. But remember the definition of what idolatry is. Anything that you're valuing to make life work for you, or you think that's going to make life worth living, whatever, anything you're valuing that's above God. Probably worth some good reflection in each of our lives on a regular kind of gut check basis, right? Keep ourselves in check. Fourth key takeaway, God is faithful. It's a good one to end on, right? God is faithful. All of us are vulnerable to fall into sin. So each of us must learn to be vigilant, dependent upon God. Remember, he's committed to giving you a way out. So maybe here's the prayer for you. This is a prayer I pray. God, give me eyes to see, ears to hear, a heart that discerns the way out, and the courage to follow it. The courage to follow it. We've got to learn to lean into him, friends. Trust his ways. Let others help us and support us. And have the courage to take the way out as he reveals it. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for your word. We always are so grateful for your truth. And today, Paul calls it out. So much of what you recorded in your word is recorded there as an example to us, as a lesson for us, so that we can learn from the good, the bad, the ugly of history. So, Lord, today, as we're looking at this text and we're thinking about our lives, Lord, would you just nudge us, open our eyes, open our awareness to how we might be falling into some complacency, or how we might be valuing other things above you to make life work, to bring us comfort, security for the future. Lord, we want to have our devotion to you be pure and undefiled, fully focused, undistracted. So would you grow that in us? Would you groom that into us? We open ourselves for your work. We desire your transformation. And we're so grateful for your faithfulness, moment by moment. Though your methods may change, your faithfulness will not. We love you. In your name, amen.